Welcome, everybody. First, happy autumn. And we're proud today to be doing history of wine in New Mexico. We thought it would be a really fun autumnal and harvest related theme today. It's a personal topic that I really love. And Rick is a fabulous, fabulous speaker and expert on this. He was our state historian for 9 years before becoming our state records administrator. I was happy to have worked with Rick while in grad school way back. So he's going to provide wonderful information today on the history of wine in New Mexico, all facets of that history. And without further ado, I think I will let you get started.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Thanks to everybody that is here and electronically with us. Going to run through a very brief, quick history of the long history of wine in New Mexico. We only have an hour. I'll be really hard pressed to get through it, but let's go ahead and get started. I want to get started with one of the topics that really comes up all the time, which I refer to as the myth of the Spanish prohibition against planting vines. Okay, so here I have listed several different actions by kings of Spain to limit or prohibit the planting of vines or production of wine in the New World. But one thing you need to remember is that as early as the 1530s, all ships coming to New Spain had to carry vine stock with them. So that was from very early on, vine stock was brought. The one that is almost always cited is the 1595 prohibition against planting new vine stock, and it called for digging up the existing ones. There's really no evidence that this was ever done. And 2 years later, the same king of Spain made a land grant in the area of what is today the southern state of Coahuila in a community that's called Parras. And it was a land grant to, in effect, establish the first bodega in the New World. So by probably the whole idea of stopping it only really lasted for a couple of years on paper and was never really put into place. So the story that you always hear that two Franciscans smuggled vines into New Mexico and started the wine industry in, you can change to the next slide. So we often hear, most often, that Fray Garcia de Zúñiga and Antonio de Arteaga in 1629, at Socorro and very likely San Antonio de Sinacu also started. There had been wine stock previously in New Mexico as early as 1580, although it was not really established. But they didn't have to sneak it in 1629 because there was really no prohibition. Even the 1595 prohibition had stated that for the production for sacramental wine for the Catholic Church, it was always permitted. So it was never going to be the case that the church couldn't grow their own wine. So we do have these grapes started here at this period. The same Father Zúñiga also was involved in the establishment of the church in Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe del Paso. And the cornerstone was laid for that in 1659. And there's a description of that. And at that time, so just that short period of time later, the area where the church was, which today is in Ciudad Juarez, was already surrounded with vineyards. So, and when we think of the wine industry in New Mexico, it's really important to remember that what is today Ciudad Juarez, and even on the other side of the river in Texas, was part of New Mexico. It was the southern gateway to New Mexico. And it was really the area where the largest production of wine took place certainly in the early period. Next slide. So this is a list from the 1750s of vine stock in El Paso. Tens of thousands of vines. Most everybody who had the wherewithal to have a plot of land grew wine for various purposes, grew grapes for various purposes, wine, raisins, vinegar, and then eventually the wine converted into brandy. These were the products that were produced very early on. The New Mexico colonial economy did not have a lot of coinage circulating, so for all practical purposes, the economy was floating on wine and brandy. We know from New Mexico tithe records that you tithe in products, in cattle, in fruit and vegetables and whatever. It was converted into wine in El Paso by the church, shipped to Chihuahua. That was really the currency. And we suspect that the vine stock came from Parras, the community that I mentioned in Coahuila. That vine stock is just mission grape. That's the standard grape. It's descended maybe from the Monica in Spain. But they didn't have to bring vine stock from Mexico City. They had a much closer, well-established northern frontier stock already to draw from. This was very well established. The wine that was produced there was exported south into Chihuahua, also supplied north into the rest of New Mexico. We can look at the next slide. You probably can't read this, so maybe I'll take a stab at it for you if you're listening. This is a quote from 1754 from a Franciscan. The Indians of Isleta have their gardens adorned with beautiful grapevines, peach trees, et cetera, et cetera. So he's basically noting the flourishing production of fruit and vegetables and grapes there in the middle of the 18th century. At that time, around the 1750s, the southernmost part of New Mexico was economically by far the most important part. I think we can go to the next slide. And this is another quote from the Bishop of Durango visiting that same area. And he says, they maintain a large number of vineyards from which they make generoso wines, even better than those from Parras. It is delightful country in summer. So again, commenting on the quality of the wine and making reference to the other major wine production area there on the northern frontier in Parras. Let's go to the next one. So in New Mexico, wine was shipped in two different size barrels, basically. One of them was referred to as a parreña, which was obviously that's the name from Parras. The word para refers to a grapevine or the trellis that the grapevine is on. It also has an interesting connection to Hebrew and crypto-Jewish for those people who are interested in it. A lot of wine producers took the name para. But that name was current, and then the other size barrel that was used in New Mexico was called a jalapeno, and it's from Jalapa, another community in Mexico, in the state of Veracruz, where wine was also produced. So two different size barrels. I don't actually know what the size was. I haven't been able to determine that. And then they had, in this picture, this is from Parras, you can see barrels and you see larger tanks. And we know that also the larger tanks were used in the colonial period. So go to the next slide, please. So again, most of what was produced was raisins, wine, or brandy, aguardiente. So the wine was often distilled into a brandy. And part of the reason this was done was to save on shipping costs. It was by reducing the volume of wine through the process to make the sort of rough brandy. They were shipping smaller containers. And we know from inventory records that the church had all of the implements related to the still and all that sort of thing. So we know that was what was going on there. Let's go on to the next one slide. So the Mesilla Valley was one of the early areas where there was a lot of development of the wine industry in New Mexico. So most of the prominent citizens of New Mexico who also own property, this, for example, is Thomas J. Bull, one of the largest and wealthiest person in Mesilla. And then the other is John D. Barncastle, also a very wealthy man, a large landowner. They pretty much all got involved in producing wine. You can see Mr. Bull's advertisement there advertises among the other things at his store, native wines and brandies. And then Barncastle has a resort, a gentleman's room. And Mesilla had at that time, and I guess again today, wine cellars and sort of like beer garden type things. It was fairly common. These were fairly large operations producing large quantities of wine. And so this really starts in the 1850s. Obviously, New Mexico is annexed by the United States in 46. There's a military period, but becomes a territory in the 1850s, and very quickly starts to be integrated into the rest of the U.S. economy. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so New Mexico has a sort of a remarkable boom and bust in the wine area. So we often look at the arrival of the Jesuits in the 1860s in Albuquerque in particular. They started producing their own wine, and they were producing enough wine, obviously for sacramental purposes, but also enough to sell in addition. And so they start arriving in the 1860s, and they established their vineyards in Old Town. And by that, very soon after, they alone were producing 4,000 gallons. So more than enough for sacramental wine and also to sell it. You can see it really starts to go very quickly. In the 1870s, New Mexico produced 16,000 gallons, so enough for local consumption. But look what happens only a decade later, almost 1 million gallons, right? 908,000 gallons. So a few years after, maybe by about 1884, New Mexico was 5th in the nation in the production of wine. We had over 3,000 acres in vineyards, which was about twice what New York really hadn't started to come online yet. And of course, California hasn't really, I mean, they've been making wine in California since at least the 1740s, but it hasn't really started to come online in a really big way. And so New Mexico is really high. But then you see a decade later, there's this really big collapse, 296,000 gallons. So a lot of factors for what for why that happens. So one of the things that happens all along through the whole history of wine is because of New Mexico's particular climate, we have drought and we have floods. So if you look at the newspapers from the period, you can see that in the various different communities. So by the 1870s, wine is really grown from Bernalillo all the way to the south, right? All along the Rio Grande and in other communities. In the Tularosa Basin, there are various different places. Anywhere that's suitable, where there's adequate water or some sort of water delivery system, New Mexico is going in really heavy for production of wine. But there are floods in a lot of those areas. When we look at the Rio Grande now, we don't really think of it. It's completely channelized now, and it doesn't flood that way. But it used to flood very dramatically. For example, one flood deposited Mesilla on a completely different side of the river, right? And it would completely wipe out vineyards all up and down the river. Through the years, there would be floods. And so a lot of times, especially in Mesilla, there were floods where they were growing, their vineyards were very close to the river, and they would just wipe them out completely. So that was one factor, the sort of the natural factor of New Mexico that was beginning to have a negative impact. The other thing is, by 1890, California has come online in a big way, and they're competing with New Mexico. They're producing vast quantities of wine. New Mexico had been in the export market, and they start to get pushed out of the export market. And also France is coming in more into so we're getting competitors from France and from California coming online. And then natural factors and production really starts to go down. And you can see by 1900, very, very drastic decline. And again, all of these factors are beginning to really attack the industry. And by 1910, for all practical purposes, there is no commercial wine industry, right? It's essentially gone. All of these things that have happened have really done that. So we don't start to get control of the flooding, especially down south where they were really heavily involved in it. Until the dams start to go in. So you get Elephant Butte, Caballo, those dams that come in to start to control the water, and then there are various different projects. But by that time, the industry is in really sad shape. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is, I've been talking mostly about what was going on in the southern part of the state. This is a slide of a vineyard in the Bernalillo area, also the 1890-ish period. So one of the things that happens is that people from European wine growing traditions are moving to New Mexico. So we have in the Mesilla area, there are Italians, Swiss, French, in the area north of Albuquerque. Of course, we have Jesuits from all over the world. North of Albuquerque, there are a number of also other Europeans, particularly Frenchmen, that move in. And Corrales becomes a very important area. The Indians in Isleta Pueblo have a very thriving business of growing grapes. So all in that area, and a lot of these people coming in. And when they're coming in, they're also bringing in the different varieties of grapes. So you can find almost everything being tried. Mission grape continues to be grown, but a lot of the European grapes are grown, some of them quite successfully. Let's go to the next slide. And this is one from a vineyard in the Old Town area in Albuquerque, also, so roughly for the same period. So one of the things that's really interesting is that at the same time, the industry is starting to move into a crisis. You're starting to get a lot of sort of jingoistic, pro-New Mexico, trying to attract people here. Let's go to the next one. And so, well, we went one too far. Yeah. Okay. So this is from the Albuquerque Journal, and there's a lot of this kind of thing. The country is peculiarly adapted to grape growing in its natural home of the vine. The quality of the grape is pronounced by competent judges superior to those raised in California, and a failure of the crop is a thing unknown. It is only a question of time when this valley throughout the entire breadth of New Mexico will be one vast vineyard, and its wine will be as famous as those of southern France. Now, this is 1884, right? This is still in the period, right? And only in 1880, we'd had nearly 1 million gallons. So this is still a moment of looking like this is going to be the greatest thing that ever happened to New Mexico. And it's sort of saying that New Mexico wine and California wine are really going to lead the way. So let's go to the next one. This I just put in there because this shows, it's interesting. It says colonial wine vat, but of course it really isn't. The picture's from 1894. This is a cowhide. So this is, the processes that were being used were still fairly simple. And everybody in this picture is smiling, including the donkey, I believe. They're very happy with the way things are going. And this is one of the European families that established in the Las Cruces area. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm sure you can't see what this is. Anyway, it's the territorial governor of New Mexico was required. The territorial governors were appointed out of Washington. They weren't elected here. And they were required to make a report on New Mexico every year. And then, so they made that report to the Secretary of the Interior. This one is from 1897. And you can see it depicts this sort of idyllic picture of grapes being harvested. Let's go to the next one. And this one, by golly, I'm going to have to move. This is 1902. Judge John F. Wendley. There is no reason conceivable while under favorable circumstances, as good results are not attainable in wine culture in this territory as in California, where it represents a money value to several millions of dollars annually. At Corrales in Bernalillo County, a French gentleman, Monsieur Louis Allery, who was one of the largest vineyard owners in the territory, procured, and then we have the grape varieties, the Chasselet, Riesling, Zinfandel, Cadoc, Medoc, Burgundy. There were many more. These were all ones that he was trying out. He now makes and ships annually several hundred barrels of wine, which cannot be told from the California clarets, except possibly that they are better in quality. So this kind of comment about the quality of New Mexico wines you can find all through this period. And of course, again, 1902, very little wine is being produced anymore, right? But this is still the report. So let's go to the next slide. Now, an interesting thing happened. Most of you who know anything about the history of wine know about the phylloxera, the little yellow root louse that devastated starting in about the 1860s, just completely devastated the wine growing regions of Europe. It started in the Rhone Valley in France. It spread over the years. It spread all through. So from France all the way to Bulgaria, from Italy to Germany, it's kind of like an aphid-looking thing, little yellow bug pest. It actually originated in the United States. So it was taken to Europe in the 1850s, not intentionally, but it was taken when rootstock from the U.S. was taken. The louse went on the trip, and it soon spread all through Europe. And so it started in 1863, I believe, and it went on for years. And even to this day, there's no cure for it. There's no definitive way to deal with it. U.S. rootstock, at least certain U.S. rootstock, is naturally protected against it. So the solution that they came up with was to take rootstock to Europe and then graft the grape they want, whatever grape they wanted, onto the American rootstock. So they talk famously about how this saved the champagne industry, and it basically saved all of the European. It's still a problem. It still exists. And I was just reading an article recently. They're not even really sure. They're trying to do a DNA analysis of the louse. So maybe one day they will actually come up with a cure, a way to treat it that won't harm the grapes. Actually, we need to go back. Yeah. So one of the things that I found quite curious, this is a professor of wine growing at the National School of Agriculture in Montpellier in France. And in 1910, his name is Pierre Vialard. In 1910, he came to the Mesilla Valley. He came to a lot of places in California, New York, but he came to the Mesilla Valley and he observed the vineyards, and he met with the people at the college, New Mexico A&M, which becomes New Mexico State University. And what he concluded was that the phylloxera would never be present in the grapes in New Mexico, and certainly not in southern New Mexico. Now, when we get to questions, there's a gentleman here I want to ask a question about that because he's the head of the Wine Growers Association. But at any rate, I thought it was fascinating that he came and he decided that New Mexico would be the place. Now, I don't know whether he took any rootstock from here. I haven't been able to figure that out. I hope to one day know. But at any rate, he made that observation I thought was interesting. Now let's go to the next one. Okay, so when we think of prohibition, most people, I imagine, think of the 1930s, right? That's what most people think of, or maybe the 1920s, but whatever. New Mexico had been experimenting with prohibition on sort of a dry county, wet county basis earlier on. So this particular observation comes from 1920, and it's about a woman in Albuquerque who we had a particular law in 1919 about prohibition here. She was producing a small amount of wine, and she wanted to give it to her neighbor. So the reason that I put this in this talk is that, number one, prohibition was early in New Mexico, early and often, you could say. And also that people continued to produce even after prohibition. So it was permissible for wine to be produced for sacramental purposes, but people still produced it, and they would occasionally run afoul of the law. And then you'd have a court case like this where somebody actually gets in trouble for having done this. We also know, for example, there was a vineyard that was started in 1875 in Mesilla, and it lasted until well into the 20th century, maybe in the 1990s. It may have been, it was finally, so it lasted, it was producing for all that period of time, prohibition or not, it continued to produce, again, small amounts, but it continued to produce it. So when we look typically at the history of wine in New Mexico and we say, what killed the wine industry definitively in New Mexico? We always say it was prohibition. Well, it was partially, but it's like most things, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so these are the elements that went together to really kill off the industry definitively. The big one, of course, is when we have national prohibition, right? Then once that happens, there's really no incentive to produce on any sort of a scale. But of course, as we've seen from the numbers, it was already very much in decline. So another thing that I've already alluded to that was another nail in the coffin was the competition. Competition from France and competition from California. California was producing high quality wine in very large quantities. France, of course, high quality wine, large quantities, a lot of shipment to the U.S. Because of the railroads, it was very easy to ship wine all over the country. So California was shipping everywhere. We talked about flooding. The most dramatic flood in New Mexico history was the period 1941, 42, 43. It rained and rained and rained and rained, basically never stopped raining. And that period of flooding pretty much wiped out what was left. The fields were underwater, they rotted, and then, we're in the war years after that, right? And the other thing which is not talked about, which is another natural phenomenon, which is it is a concern of wine producers now, and it has always been throughout the history of time, and that's soil salination. So any irrigated land will eventually basically salt up, right? And so now there are very sophisticated ways for wine growers to test the salinity of their fields, in addition to everything else. I mean, you can test soil acidity, you can test everything, but it's a constant concern. Anything that's irrigated, actually any crop, it's something you have to deal with. But this has been a particular problem in New Mexico. And again, it's still an issue. I mean, you can look it up on the internet even today, and you'll find that there's a lot of recommendations that are being done, various different things that are done to deal with this particular issue. Okay, let's go to the next one. So now this is probably what most people are really interested in. Nobody really cares that much about the actual history of the wine in New Mexico. What people are really interested in is there's been an amazing renaissance, right? And there truly has been, right? So there's probably some arguments about who was first in various different things, but generally, I think there's a consensus that La Viña, 1977, and then these others, which you probably can't read. I'll just jump up here because I can't read them either. La Chiripada, 1981, La Com, 81, and then Luna Rosa, 2001. These are some part of the, and of course now, I mean, I don't know what the current figure is, 60 or more wineries and growing, I imagine, producing wines that are winning awards, and it's just been pretty amazing. Considering what it once was and where it is now, pretty remarkable. And I would imagine that the future looks pretty bright. In my own opinion, and we were discussing this before, one of the challenges that it seems to be is right now, a lot of New Mexico wines are, I think, not competitively priced in the market for people who don't discriminate. I myself do not have a sophisticated palate, so I can't really tell which the best wines are. And so price does influence my wine drinking decision. How are we doing on time? I think we're doing okay. We can have some questions. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next one. Well, actually, before I leave, I encourage all of you, it's okay, but I encourage everyone, take a wine tour of New Mexico, right? Get out and see all the different varieties that are being grown. I was just commenting to a colleague here that my particular variety, I didn't know anybody was growing, and she informed me that it's been grown quite lovingly in Carlsbad. And Luna Rosa. And Luna Rosa. Okay, so it's even in my hometown. So more and more varieties. Montepulciano is my favorite, and I'm glad to see this being grown. Okay, now, so another wonderful thing that happens here, I mean, I'm a booster of our colleges and universities, and New Mexico State University has agricultural science centers in various different places around the state that do experimentation, and they're very heavily involved with the people who are producing wine in New Mexico. They do a lot of very valuable research. They have a lot of fun with it. This is a group that of students, and they're mashing grapes there. There's a center in Alcalde up north. There's one in Los Lunas, and then there's one over in Deming. And of course, there's quite a bit of development of vineyard activity in the Deming area. But there's a lot that's done there, and there always has been. So when it was the College of Agricultural Art and Mechanic Arts back before it became the university, they were involved even as New Mexico began to slide into prohibition and the industry went down. The university was involved in research about wine variety, wine growing, and all that sort of thing. And it will, I'm sure it will continue to be a great source of information for the wine producers in New Mexico. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is totally outdated because this is 1991. But this just to give you an idea of the location. You can basically see, and we've talked about this so now we're talking from Taos all the way to Sunland Park, right? Top to bottom. And then here we have Tularosa, Alamogordo, a bunch over here, and then over at Roswell, Carlsbad, which I was not even aware we were in, and then up in Farmington, literally all over, probably anywhere that grapes could grow, which is really fascinating because if you look, there's a snapshot of New Mexico that was done in 1801, and it was done by the Franciscans, and they look at all the places where grapes could possibly grow. And of course, they had no idea that you could grow in all those different areas. But again, this is out of date. I'm sure by now there's many more. And I just threw up preferential tax rate. I wanted to talk just a little bit about some things. And again, I'm sure that something happens every single year in the legislature related to this kind of thing, but let's look at the last slide here. So I just threw up two things that I thought were kind of interesting to help the industry. At least I think they help the industry. So in 2015, so a reciprocity law. So it used to be the case that if you had say a craft brewery, and one of your colleagues had a little bodega, you couldn't, a visitor couldn't go into your place and sample the wine. They could sample the craft beer, but they couldn't sample the wine, and vice versa. So in 2015, a reciprocity law was passed so that you could do both. You could sample both of those. And I imagine for tourists and various different things, that probably, and hopefully for the industry. And then the other thing, and again, we're in 2024, headed for 2025, but in 2021, there was a major bipartisan liquor law reform in New Mexico that changed lots of things. Things that we wouldn't be interested in talking about wine, like the little bottles and those sorts of things, the prohibition against that sort of thing. But lots of things that were done to promote the industry. So I think a lot has been done. I think the future is hopefully very bright for the wine industry in New Mexico. And we can go to the last slide, which has nothing on it except conclusions. And I actually hit my target. So I wanted to leave some time for questions, comments. And I'm very happy to know that head of the New Mexico Wine Growers Association is with us. I had a question for you. Do you remember what it was? I forgot already. Golly. Yes, sir. It was about phylloxera. Oh, yeah. Do you know, is that still an issue that you folks deal with?
So phylloxera was not discovered in New Mexico until 2019, 2020. So for the most of the run of the time we've been growing grapes, it wasn't detected. It is in small, isolated areas because we don't have contiguous vineyards planted next to each other. It's not spreading rampant and wildly, but it's contaminated vines. So the way that it moves is you a bad vine and you plant it in your vineyard and then it spreads.
So it is.
At this point, it's mostly controlled in New Mexico, but it's detected.
Can you say what region it is?
I don't know.
You don't know. You just know that it's here.
Yeah, our former viticulturists said definitively at our last conference that it is in New Mexico. It's just it's not rampant.
So when this Frenchman came, when he was here, he was probably right on that it would have been very unlikely that he would have found it. That's interesting. That was really what I was curious about.
I mean, because of the high elevation and the dry climate, you don't really have much pests
Mhm.
in New Mexico. So overall, from a growing region, it is less likely to have pests than
Mhm.
someplace damp, moist, humid,
Right.
etc.
Right. Well, thank you for that. That's good to know. But it's also sad to know too that we have.
Pretty much everywhere in the
Yeah,
United States. So we just have a lot less of it.
So, would the same process of grafting onto pest resistant rootstock would work here?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's only when it's called own rooted, when it's on
Mhm.
its own original root,
Right.
that's when phylloxera comes in and is damaging. But if it's on grafted rootstock, for the most part, it should be
And
fine.
do they know did it come from, was it brought in? Do we know? Are they,
Where the phylloxera came from?
yeah, I mean, that we have here, we don't
I
know.
don't have that information.
Okay. Because I know they're doing DNA on it to try, I just yesterday was reading an article about the studies on the bug.
Mhm.
Anyway, thank you very much for that. Anybody else have a question or a comment? Go ahead, please.
So my question is, I did a little bit of digging and what amount of research, and maybe this is more of a personal question, but in the history of Albuquerque and Old Town, you know, my research, limited as it may be, indicates there were 16 wineries in the 1890s to 1880s to 1890s. The highest concentration in Old Town was around 16 wineries, which that went away until we changed the law recently that allows for package sales in Old Town. And we'll be opening up our winery in Old Town. So we'll be the first in many, many years, at least since the 60s, when they prohibited the sale of package. But do you know much about that era of Albuquerque, Old Town? I know there's old vines that, you know, people have, but is there a good resource for more information?
Yeah, I mean, if you'll leave me your card or something, because there is a lot of information out there. I mean, as I was saying to your colleague earlier, I mean, right now I'm a bureaucrat. I'm not really I'm a sort of sideline as a historian, but I really would like to do a really thorough history, you know, getting out all the myth and legend yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information out there, and it remains to be done. I mean, I totally understand why people think it's romantic that Franciscan monks, and of course they weren't monks anyway, smuggled vines here, but you know, I mean, I guess it sounds romantic or something, cloak and dagger, but they really didn't need to do that.
Speaking of that, what is the source document that specifically identifies 1629? Is there a written book that we're looking to say that this is the date, or who has that?
Yeah, again, I could probably provide that to you. That's pretty well documented. What's
Church records?
yeah, I think it's in a church type report, I believe. I'm not entirely certain, but and the one, you know, I think the reference is always to Socorro, right? Well, it's just as likely it was Seneca, which is right there, right? I mean, there's no reason why it would have been one or the other. And since we know that he was also in the Guadalupe del Paso area, and we know that although that church is not until 59, when the cornerstone is laid, there already are vineyards all the way around. So maybe it was even earlier there. One thing I didn't mention, so again, that part I think needs to be included in the story because that was New Mexico, right? And on the other side of the river, the largest hacienda in colonial New Mexico, we didn't really have very many full complex haciendas where we had livestock and crops and everything, but there was one there in the area that we know of. It was called San Antonio. It was on the other side of the river, so it would be in Texas today. That was the first really major wine production grape operation. A former governor of New Mexico retired there and had a really big hacienda there, and was growing grapes and producing stuff. And again, at the level of export, right? So this was up and down the Camino Real. So that area, of course, that definitively was later, but there possibly was another complex hacienda north, maybe in the Conatillo, Texas, or possibly into New Mexico, that was destroyed, that we don't really know anything about and don't have any records of. That also could have been another area where there was activity. And there is a reference to, and I mentioned it on a slide, Augustine Rodriguez, another Franciscan, was up here with Rootstock in the 1580s. I don't know what he did. That's just a reference that we have. That could have been planted in somewhere. And so maybe even earlier. Anywhere there were going to be Spaniards, there was going to be wine. That's pretty much a given. Anywhere that we had. And as I say, that whole idea of ripping out the roots, and that never happened. There's no evidence that ever happened. That probably didn't continue to plant, and but nobody went, and that would have been stupid anyway. I mean, why in the world would you do that? Let's go rip all the rootstock out just because. Yeah. Anything more? How are we doing on time? Well, we got a little bit more. Yes, sir.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. So the first thing that struck me was you showed an image that was an advertisement for native grape wine, native wines. Is that like a colloquial term used for mission grape wines? Because I've seen an archaeological inventory of the Pueblo or the mission at Isleta that included native grape wines. And so I didn't know if people were actually experimenting with native grape wine production or.
No, I understand what you're getting at. You mean the pre-European, the actual, yeah. No, I'm pretty sure they're talking about the mission grape.
Okay.
And although by that period, Bull's thing, they could have been experimenting with other, he might just say locally grown. It could have been a European grape. But it's kind of interesting. I know there's one winery in Mesilla that is where you can get mission wine. Okay. So in the colonial period, when travelers would come to, say, El Paso or San Elizario was another community south of El Paso, that was sort of a Garden of Eden kind of thing. And travelers would stop there and they would comment about how wonderful the wine was, right? Well, the mission grape, it's fairly pinky, not really dark red. And when they got to Chihuahua and they're converting all this New Mexico wine, this is the currency, and they're saying this is really awful wine. So it wasn't being praised as being great wine. I think they like the brandy, the aguardiente better. I'm sure it's pretty harsh, but yeah. But again, I think those are probably mission grapes they're referring to mostly.
Cool. And then the other question I had was, do you think the Pueblo Revolt also played a role in the downturn of wine production in this part of the
I'm sure it must have done. Part of the problem is, as you obviously know, the records were destroyed. So what sort of activity was actually going on? I mean, it could have been way more widespread than we think. Again, I always say wherever there's Spaniards, there's going to be wine. There were a fair number of Spaniards by that period, and I imagine they were growing, even if it were just on their own fairly small things. I mean, in the El Paso area, where cumulatively it was a lot, it was mostly, with a few exceptions, it was fairly small because we actually have the acreage. In 1751, the governor of New Mexico required everybody to produce all their land titles, and we have all those records. So we can see how much land people had, and almost everybody has a website, and they're growing some grapes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Could you identify yourself?
My name is Joe Scala. I'm a PhD student at UNM in the geography department.
Great, thank you.
My focus is on historical and contemporary wine in the U.S. Mexico.
Great, perfect. So maybe you'll write the book.
We can talk about it.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, I'd like to thank Dr. Rick Hendricks for joining us and doing this wonderful lecture today. And to thank everybody for coming. This is our third Tertulia Historica post-pandemic. So this was a regular in-person lunchtime history session, which we are continuing monthly. Next month, we have Rob Martinez, our state historian, doing brujeria, history of witchcraft and superstitions supernatural in New Mexico. So that will be on Wednesday, October 23rd, noon. And we just set up a new page. If you go to newmexicohistory.org, special projects and programs, you can now look up the Tertulia. So we'll keep adding our future talks. We're recording all of our talks. So if you've missed one, you can go back and watch it again, or if there's something you missed during the talk and want to rewatch, you can do that. I'm sorry, the SOGA 100 Years is already up on the website, and we'll have this one by Rick up pretty soon. So come back and join us again. And thank you all for coming today.
Yeah.